Good morning. Three giants in the history of art will compete for our attention today. Peter Bruegel, El Greco, and Caravaggio, each represented by a painting from the pinnacle of his achievement. Each artist is of a different nationality, and none would have known the other's works, yet the three pictures were painted within a span of about 40 years. The first artist is Peter Bruegel the Elder, born in the Netherlands about 1528-30 and active in Antwerp and Brussels until his death in 1569. He spelled his name as we have here, B-R-U-E-G-E-L, and the H sometimes seen after the G is not correct. His name is pronounced Bruegel, although in Dutch the G would be guttural and it would sound more like Bruegel. But in English, if that's difficult, we often use a hard G, as I shall. Peter Bruegel the Elder, Hunters in the Snow, Winter, signed and dated 1565, painted in oil on oak, a panel 46 by 63 3/4 inches or 118 by 163 centimeters. Few landscapes are as famous as this one. A scene combining meticulously observed and painted realistic details with a scope and sweep that, when seen in the museum, pulls us intensely toward it and then brings us to a stop well short of it. That halt, at least for me, happens because you are conscious that you are seeing the landscape from a point fixed by the artist, and that if you come too close too soon, you will miss the chance to let your eyes swing across and into this astonishing space. Then one has time for the details. Do the same with the image you are now looking at. Let your eyes take in the powerfully constructed space and breathe it in, as it were. Then approach the foreground. The organization of the space is along diagonals, and the foreground is established by the diagonal summit of a hill crossed by a diagonal of trees. The hunters and dogs follow the line of the trees, preparing to go down to the village. But beyond them is a fascinating little scene set in front of an inn, named Under the Stag on its signboard, where two men and two women are attending to or near a roaring fire blown by the wind, singeing the hairs off a pig. Pigs are not skinned, so the stiff hairs were usually singed off. That involved placing a freshly slaughtered pig on a bed of straw set aflame while the carcass was covered with straw 2 or 3 times during the process. And here a man appears to be adding a sheaf of straw to the fire, and a woman carries another sheaf out from the door behind him. Since this process is something outside our sheltered modern existence, I think it deserves this attention. Peter Bruegel's paintings, even the allegorical ones, are about his time. Not incidentally, but specifically, intentionally. So we must pay attention to his details and try to understand them in their moment. Knowing what is going on means that we understand more fully the pointed contrast between that bright hot fire with its backdrop of warm red brick and the three hunters dressed in black and gray and dark brown, accompanied by skeletal black trees, while their feet press measurably into the frigid white snow. The fire represents both warmth and satisfying food, while the hunters are cold and bone-weary and have returned from the hunt with only a single fox that hangs from the spear of the hunter in gray. And the more than a dozen dogs are even more bedraggled looking. So the men and their dogs follow the diagonal line of the trees down the hill and into the landscape. And notice that the diagonal of trees is accented by 5 black birds, the last in liberating flight. I say liberating because this incomparable inspiration of Bruegel's is one of those moments in a great painting that is indispensable. It could not imaginably be removed without leaving the painting a lesser creation. First of all, it frees itself and us from the line of trees, releasing our eyes and our spirit into the vast space opening up. Like the trees, It moves simultaneously downward and inward, but in free flight, not lockstep. Moreover, the contours of the gliding bird's wings find an echo in the steep mountain crags in the far distance, a connection of near and far, and across the painted surface. The bird also helps us adjust to the huge shift in scale from the large figures in the foreground to the tiny figures in the middle distance, which are beneath the soaring bird. I think if you removed the bird, the transition in scale would seem much more abrupt. This brings us to the frozen ponds. First, don't pass over the near ice on this side of the bridge, the lower right-hand corner, where we find two women on the ice and a man on the near bank who may be collecting tree branches for kindling wood. In fact, this whole area, with those figures, the bridge with another woman carrying a very large bundle of firewood on her head, the snow-clad houses clustered on each side, interspersed with delicately brushed trees, this whole area is full of delectable painting and description. The pond is given over to 7 men and boys who engage in the sport of curling, and some, I think, are fishing through the ice. And the larger pond, beyond, is devoted to skaters, some more skillful than others. The ice of these ponds is a gray-green that connects the earth with the wintry blue-green of the sky. There is so much more. To the left of the skating pond is a snowy road between trees with a loaded wagon and a figure on foot moving toward buildings clustered as if for warmth around a village church. If you permit your eye to travel to the mountain, you will find still other large buildings. And all that is along the dominant diagonal first established by the foreground trees. There's another part of this painted world to the left of that strong diagonal, just as full of description and life in a cold winter, including a large town in the distance. Now, let's consider some questions about this scene. First, where is this cold winter landscape? I have said that Bruegel painted his time, and I was serious, but he had larger plans for his world. This is the Netherlands just before its political split into Belgium and Holland, but these mountains weren't there before or after. Those are the Alps, which the artist not only traveled over on a long study tour in Italy from 1551 to 1554, but lingered among on his return trip. They entered his sketchbooks, took root in his imagination, and reappeared in this and other paintings. Why was Hunters in the Snow created? This painting was one of a series of related landscapes of the months commissioned by a wealthy Antwerp merchant called Nicholas Jongelink. They were displayed as a continuous frieze in a room of his mansion. 5 of these still exist, but whether they are 5 of 12 paintings of the months or of 6 paintings of seasons, 2 months per painting, is still a complicated and much debated matter. The Kunsthistorisches Museum, which owns this one and 2 of the others, confidently asserts that there were only 6 paintings. The argument for 12 months relies on a 1566 inventory related to Jongelink's pledging these and other paintings as collateral on a debt. We learn there that he then owned, quote, 16 paintings by Bruegel, among them the 12 months. I will stop there and say only that the great Hunters in the Snow winter was probably the first in the series, and not only because of the calendar. A compelling reason is that the frieze of paintings installed by the collector would have had a powerful beginning with the much discussed diagonal slicing from left to right. All of the landscapes in the series share a common motif, a hill in the foreground leading to an unfolding view of an extensive landscape in which a mountainous terrain often figures. Bruegel found in the Alps one of the principal components from which he constructed some of the most innovative and unforgettable landscapes in Western art. Hunters in the Snow, the crown jewel of this series, embodies an almost philosophical worldview. It ranges from the artist's intent probing of life in his time to an imaginary sweep of space, limitless, timeless, world without end. Our second great painting is by El Greco. Born Domenico Theotokopoulos in Crete in 1541. Probably trained in the Byzantine style traditional in Crete, he went to Venice for further study soon after 1560. Venice, which had dominion over Crete, was also rich in Byzantine art, but now had a newly famous school of painters, including Titian, Veronese, and Tintoretto. By 1570, he was in Rome, and he finally moved to Spain in 1577, settling in Toledo, where he died in 1614. He acquired the nickname El Griego, the Greek, later altered to the Italian form Greco. But this cosmopolitan artist always proudly signed himself with his full Greek name. The Burial of Count Orgaz, 1586, oil on canvas, 15 feet 9 inches high, approximately by 11 feet 9 inches, or 4.8 meters by 3.6 meters. It is in Toledo, in Santo Tomé. When you enter the small domed chapel in the parish church of Santo Tomé in Toledo and see the wall filled with this astounding painting, you will have experienced one of El Greco's most strikingly original works. In reproduction, it's still astounding, but keep reminding yourselves that it's more than 15.5 feet high. It bursts upon our eyes all at once, both because it is so densely packed with figures, some in solemn poses, some in a swirl of movement, and because it is at the same time such a thoroughly integrated composition that our eyes are amazed. We quickly see two distinct areas of activity. The first is directly in front of our eyes. Remember the size of the painting. Standing in front of it, directly in front of your eyes, the lower part focuses on two saints, one young, one old, dressed in magnificent gold and red ecclesiastical robes, like the blue one worn by St. Donatian in Jan van Eyck's painting in Lecture 3, who are lowering the body of a dead man in full armor. Among those near them are a boy, a monk, and two priests, while a row of men in black are arrayed behind them. The second area is above, and it is less substantial, less physical, with several large figures, the Virgin Mary, John the Baptist, and Christ at the apex, and a host of smaller saints and others in attendance, all impossibly supported by insubstantial swirling cloud shapes. Yet both tiers, both levels are integrated, belong together, despite their contrast. El Greco was 45 years old when he finished the painting, and he knew its worth. He called it my sublime work. We've said little about the contracts that artists were often bound to observe. We did note that Duccio was required to undertake no other work while painting the Maestà. Contracts normally existed for such commissions, and we still have the contract for the burial of Count Orgaz. It was very specific. First, it reads, "The wall shall be painted from the top of the arch to the bottom, all to be done on canvas down to the epitaph which is on the said wall, and the rest below in fresco. In the latter shall be painted a tomb, and on the canvas shall be represented a procession, how the priest and the other clerics were saying the office for the funeral of Don Gonzalo Ruiz de Toledo, Lord of the town of Orgaz, and how Saint Augustine and Saint Stephen descended from heaven to bury the body of this knight, one holding him by the head and the other by the feet, and placing him in the sepulchre, and around it many people watching. Above all this shall be depicted an open heaven in glory." This contract, signed on March 18th, 1586, stipulated that the work had to be completed by Christmas, 9 months. Having the contract proves extremely helpful in explaining the actions of the two saints who are entombing the body, because the fresco with the sepulchre does not exist. It was either never painted or was later destroyed or otherwise lost. The miraculous burial of the Lord of Orgoth as his reward for having rebuilt the church at his own expense dated from the 1320s. The painting was commissioned some 260 years afterward by the parish priest of Santo Tomé, apparently to reprimand the populace of Orgoth, who not long before had the nerve to object to the tax they had paid to the monastery over the intervening centuries. Although the contract gives us many of the crucial details about the painting and its subject, we must take a second look. St. Augustine and St. Stephen support the armored body of Orgoth at the front edge of the painted space, presenting him to the viewer as they lower him into the now absent painted tomb. They somberly, slowly bend over to deposit the body. Yet there's something unusual here. Only one saint's hand, Stephen's on the left, is visible. And it touches the white winding sheet, but does not seem to press through against the armor, even though the Count's legs pass between the saint's body and arm. There is, in fact, no sense that these miraculously appearing saints are holding anything or supporting any weight. And then there's the head of the Count, projecting beyond Augustine's cope, equally without support, and yet with an expression of repose, a wonderful head. El Greco is drawing a finely weighted distinction between these long-dead saints and the just deceased Count. Their interaction is not of this world. St. Stephen seems to look down toward the tomb, while Augustine's aged, magnificent face looks at that of Orgoth with a tenderness enhanced by his soft white beard. The graceful circle formed by the three bodies is marked at its center by one of the hands of the mourner standing behind them, an elegant hand, a hand framed by a white lace cuff against black. It's like a blossoming flower or a shining star. His other hand frames the head of St. Stephen. This man's tunic is adorned prominently with the red cross of St. James, Spain's patron saint. There are wonderful details, like the skillfully painted armor of the Count, or the scene embroidered large on St. Stephen's cope, which shows his martyrdom. He was the first martyr. And next to that is the small boy, who indicates the body of the Count with his left hand while holding a long, slender candle in his right, and who must be El Greco's son, Jorge Manuel, since the handkerchief in his pocket bears the date 1578, not the date of the painting, but the date of the boy's birth. The rest of the procession comprises a Franciscan friar and an Augustinian monk in conversation at the left, and two clerics at the right, including a priest whose transparent white surplice is a marvel of painting, and who looks up in amazement at the heavenly apparition above. And then there is the long row of excellent somber portraits of black-clad mourners with a wide array of poses and gestures. But as we look up toward the heavenly tier, one thing is apparent. In this painting, El Greco used two different styles, a more realistic one for the earthly realm and an expressively exaggerated one for the heavenly. The latter is painted like a swirling vision. It has echoes of both Byzantine and Gothic art and shows Christ at the top and the large figures of the Virgin and John the Baptist just below him. The elongated Baptist also clearly demonstrates the influence of Tintoretto, perhaps the Venetian painter who left the deepest mark on El Greco. Over the Virgin Mary's shoulder, we see the yellow-robed St. Peter, the keys to the kingdom of heaven dangling from his hand. Connecting the two levels, the earth with the heaven, is an angel who carries the soul of the dead count into paradise. The soul appears like a gray, diaphanous infant being slid into heaven, and it is a haunting moment. The angels' yellow-gray drapery dips down to the heads of the mourners below, and his wing nearly touches the flame of a candle. On the right side, a tall processional cross reaches high into the vaporous glory. These connections between the tiers of earth and heaven are wonderful compositional devices of El Greco, but I wonder if you're already thinking of a painting we've very recently seen whose composition is unquestionably echoed in this one. Titian's Assumption of the Virgin in Lecture 8, a painting that El Greco certainly spent many, many hours contemplating in his early career in Venice. Last, but far from least, we will look at an impressive and moving painting by Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. He was born probably in Milan in 1571, but he grew up in the nearby town of Caravaggio, and he is known by that name rather than his given or family name. It was used, that is to say, Caravaggio was used by contemporary writers to distinguish him from the other Michelangelo, who died only 7 years before Caravaggio's birth. His youthful apprenticeship was in Milan with an artist who practiced a naturalistic style which the young painter embraced. Caravaggio moved to Rome. In late 1592 or early 1593, he acquired, quite early, princely patronage for works whose subjects were sometimes mythological or secular, sometimes religious. In both, his style was marked equally by vigorous physical realism and strong contrasts of light and dark. The combination was forceful and often shocking to conservative taste. It could not be ignored, and so he had violent detractors and enthusiastic supporters. By the turn of the century, he had received major commissions for large paintings in Roman churches, and from then until his premature death, he turned his attention nearly exclusively to religious subjects. The Entombment, painted approximately 1602 to 1604, oil on canvas, a large painting, 118 by 80 inches, that would be in centimeters about 300 by 203 centimeters, is today in the Vatican in the picture gallery, the Pinacoteca, but it was not painted for that site. This altarpiece was one of the most significant commissions that Caravaggio received in Rome. It was for a chapel in the new church, in fact, always known as the Chiesa Nuova, the new church, Santa Maria in Vallicella, a church closely identified with the spirit of the Catholic Counter-Reformation struggle to reinvigorate the church after the Protestant Reformation. It is in this context that Caravaggio's religious art is best understood. The subject is occasionally described as a deposition, but there is no cross. There is an echo of Michelangelo's famous Pietà in St. Peter's, in the long curve of Christ's arm, and perhaps more pointedly in the supporting hand beneath his shoulder. Given Caravaggio's frequent borrowings or emulations of Michelangelo's painted and carved poses and gestures, it was probably an intentional echo here, and a meaningful one, since the chapel in the Chiesa Nuova was already dedicated to the Pietà, so it might be considered a combined Pietà entombment. But whereas Michelangelo's Pietà is a monumental pyramid with Christ as the core, here Christ is at the bottom of a slowly falling diagonal. The diagonal begins with one of the Marys, I believe the Magdalene, standing at the right, both her expressive hands raised high and looking upward with tearful eyes. While one arm is vertical, the hand filling the corner, the other starts a slow downward fanning movement. Another of the Marys presses a cloth to her eyes, and beside her head is the blue cowled head of the Madonna, an older face whose forehead is furrowed with sorrow. Directly below her head is that of Nicodemus, who wraps the legs of Christ with both his arms, and to the left of his head is the head of John the Evangelist, who supports the torso. Several crucial details need to be observed here. The hand of John that supports the shoulder of Christ also actually touches and opens the lance wound in his side, forcing us to contemplate it. The arms of the Madonna are spread wide, completely across the picture, but because they are obscured by John and Nicodemus, we see only her hands. The left one in deep shadow at our far right, and the right one raked by light on our left above Christ's head. This seemingly disembodied hand is given movement by the light, and its gesture is quite intentionally a benediction. It floats, as does Christ's head below it. The black space between them as poignant as the contrast between the pallor of his face and the warmth of his mother's hand. This fan of hands and heads comes to a momentary rest in the brightly lit body of Christ, only to be continued by the downward curve of his arm and the accompanying white winding sheet. The wounded hand touches the great slab of stone upon which they stand, a stone which must be understood as the lid of the tomb, its corner jutting almost into our real space. Since all of this takes place against an utterly black background, the light which carves all the figures out of the darkness has to be understood as a miraculous light, as always in Caravaggio. But this is not merely a dramatic flourish, for the black is absence of light and of life, and the bright body a prefiguring of the resurrection. To fully understand the painting, we need to know its placement in its original chapel, where it no longer is. That chapel is shallow, and the painting filled the space above the altar. A copy is there today. The bottom of the frame, and therefore the painted sarcophagus lid, was perhaps a foot above the altar table. Christ's hand touches that stone lid and leads us to the altar. His body is symbolically about to be deposited upon the altar, from which it symbolically rises when the newly consecrated host, the communal wafer, is raised during the Mass, and the priest recites, "This is my very body." Just minutes ago, we saw the lowering of another body into a tomb, though the painted tomb is now gone in El Greco's masterpiece. And we've already seen a strikingly similar allusion to the meaning of the rite of the Mass in Roger van der Weyden's deposition in Lecture 3. But this is even more astonishingly direct. Caravaggio's entombment is different than Roger's deposition in the still greater physical immediacy of the sacred actors here. Their emergence from the darkness is startling, not just close, but pressingly, urgently near to us, tangibly. The kinship is more with his Italian forebearers Giotto and Masaccio than with van der Weyden, which is to say that Caravaggio revived their substantial volumetric bodies, and with them the power to convince the viewer of their reality. But Caravaggio had more invested in this effort. Like many of the finest artists of this Counter-Reformation period, Caravaggio and his ecclesiastical patrons wanted us to be convinced that their faith and its history was actual and authentic. So by making it at once miraculous and physical, they fused the spiritual and theological with the presence of here and now. In the entombment, Caravaggio achieved this by contrasting dramatic light with a solemn, controlled composition and measured accents. Astonishingly, it was painted with no underpainting and no known preparatory drawings. This is not the place to recount Caravaggio's turbulent life. He remains an enigma. But his revolutionary art established itself. His influence on art history is incalculable. And his death in 1610, at age 38, was a tragic loss. Thank you for your attention.